today I want to talk to you about some facts and some theories about what happens to the brain when people sing. And I'm approaching singing today as a biologist, which means I'm asking, what are the brain circuits that make it possible for us to produce this natural vocal behavior? And also, what is the survival value that would account for how this vocal behavior evolved? Why does our species have this singing behavior? We have speech, we have crying and laughing, and we have singing, and all human cultures have singing, and I'd like to understand what this brings to the species that can account for its existence. So I'm going to give you an outline of the talk so you hopefully can stay oriented, the points I'm going to try and talk about. So we're going to talk about how the body and the brain register whether we are safe or threatened. That's a system that pervades the entire body, and it's going to figure into the neuroscience of singing, so we need that background. Then I'm going to talk about how singing helps us regulate our sense of safety or recover from danger, for one reason, because it forces us to take a deep breath. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the voice and how the voice plays into the special neural circuits that are engaged by singing. I'm going to touch very briefly on the effects of the tunes of songs, the words of songs, and the stories they tell, because this part of the theory is pure speculation, so I don't want to go on too long about it. And at this time at the end, I'll just tell you a couple of testable predictions in an experiment that we're trying to start at UCSD right now to see if the theory that I unfold for you today can be substantiated. So we start with this idea of danger and safety. How does the brain and the body know when the organism is in danger? And these things I'm telling you in the next couple slides are true for any animal, a cat, a bird, a lizard, and humans as well. So this is an oversimplified cartoon, but it tells you just the parts you need to know today. There are two basic opposing forces in this regulatory system. One that's there to help us respond when we are threatened, and it is often called the fight or flight response. For the aficionados, that's the sympathetic nervous system. It's associated with the hormone adrenaline. So the fight or flight response is what happens when an organism receives some kind of a perceived threat. So it's going along normally. This is supposed to represent time and the amount of activity in these two neural populations. And the red line is this response to threat. The blue line is going to be our calm response, or our response to safety and security. So normally, hopefully, the animal has a sense of safety and security. It always has a little bit of activation, preparing for the possibility that you might have to act physically in response to something. And when a mild threat comes in, here the adrenaline pumps up, the threat safety system gets temporarily shut down, and this fight or flight response gets pumped up. So this means the adrenaline is pumping, the muscles are getting energy and blood, and all the systems of the body that you need to fight a battle, to escape a predator, to deal with an immediate life threat, are optimized for their best function. But in order to do that, we have to take resources away from all those other things that are equally important but that can wait. The things we do to nurture and sustain ourselves. So this would be digestion, sleep, healing of wounds, and other sort of restorative functions. And so that system is sometimes called the rest and digest response, and the long word for it is the parasympathetic nervous system. So when a threat happens, we're supposed to activate this response that gets our body revved up to deal with the threat at hand. And then when we see signals that cue us that the threat has been resolved, so the lion that we saw in our peripheral vision decided not to chase us and walked away, then those threat signals are supposed to go away, right? And then our healthy, self-sustaining signals are supposed to come back up and rebound and bring us back to a state of everything's okay and my body can take care of myself. And so this would be considered sort of a healthy response. And the two things that are important about it is that it affects the whole body, literally every organ system of your entire body, from the top of your head to the bottom of your toes, has some response to threat, and then some compensating opposite response to the perception of safety. The problem is that sometimes the system doesn't work properly. And so here's an example of what would happen if a system was chronically stressed. It's repeatedly stressed before it has a chance to fully recover. Or maybe it encounters a stress that's so extreme that it's just not able to recover. And in that situation, you can see that every time a mild stress comes along in this individual, a really big fight or flight response gets triggered. They get a big burst of, let's say, fear or anxiety. And even though it will taper off a little when the threat goes away, they never receive that safety signal that tells them everything's okay again. And so it just lingers forever in this kind of low-grade sense of stress or watchfulness. And these functions that are part of the parasympathetic, whose job it is to sort of rebuild and restore the system, they never get a chance to fully come back online. And so you end up with things like immune suppression, sleep disruption, difficulty with the digestive system. People complain of stomach troubles. And this is very common for a lot of kinds of anxiety, depression, and other mental health conditions. And so it's a problem for humans in particular. And so the goal that many have is to come up with some kind of a therapeutic intervention so you can take a person who's in this chronic stress state, introduce some real or artificial stimulus that represents the signal to the sort of body-brain that says, everything's okay now, you can go back to taking care of yourself, and cause the system to rebound and return back to this normal, healthy state where it's supposed to be resting. So what kind of interventions have people found so far? Well, it turns out that the most effective interventions that are known to date are not drugs, not surgeries, but practices that have gone back for thousands of years in traditional cultures. And so one example is yoga, another is meditation. There are Tai Chi, and I know I can't pronounce this correctly, Qigong, and other of these arts, which have in common that they cause someone to interact with their body in a very specific way that has been found to reorganize this sort of mind-body circuit and restore that sense of the rested digest function. And there's some very nice scientific studies specifically with yoga and with meditation in which people were tested physiologically and shown that it had benefits for their ability to restore function and serve the function of the stimulus that could bring their system back to this normal equilibrium. So the theory begins when I read about all of the systems that are known to have this beneficial effect, have in common some kind of controlled deep breathing exercise. Something either explicitly cued breathing exercises or indirectly occurring deep, slow breathing. And that's interesting because we know that there's a feedback system from the muscles of the breath that controls this circuit. And so I became intrigued by the possibility of deep breathing to reset this emotional equilibrium because, of course, when you sing, you can't help but take a lot of deep breaths. So to outline this circuit in sort of simple form, this is just to explain that deep breathing stimulates what I'm going to call the calming center. I'm trying not to throw a lot of acronyms and Latin words at you. If you want to know which nucleus I'm talking about, I'd be glad to answer questions at the end. But to keep it simple, we'll call this the calming center. And there are sensory nerves in your breathing muscles that when you take a deep breath, and specifically when you blow out, when you exhale, they send a signal that stimulates a nerve called the vagus nerve. Okay, so the vagus nerve is the master nerve of this rest and digest program, and it's stimulated by the exhaling breath. And that signal goes to this calming center, which sends signals out to all other parts of the body through the vagus. In particular, it sends a signal directly to the heart that slows down the heart rate. So you know when you are getting chased by a lion, your heart starts pounding. So when you get the signal that everything's okay, you've got to slow your heart rate down, and that is one of the functions of this circuit. It also slows your breathing down. So you know if you meet a person who's very nervous and panicked, they may speak in a very breathy, in a sort of out-of-breath way. And as they calm down, they will begin to take deeper breaths, and of course that is a positive feedback loop, which can help them stabilize in a more calm state of mind. And once this calm state of mind is affected, this vagal system also sends signals out through the vagus nerve to all the other organs of the body, telling it to bring all those restorative functions back online. Your immune system and your healing and your digestion and your sleep. Because the body perceives that it's in a safe environment to take care of all of those needs. And people in the literature often refer to this, when this whole circuit is functioning the way I described to you, a person is said to have vagal tone, which just means that this vagus nerve is on, enough, a good amount. So when you hear that term vagal tone, it's just referring to this circuit is active, and so the vagus is having a healthy amount of activity. And it's a useful shorthand, so I'll come back to that term a couple of times later. Okay, so what has this got to do with singing? So here's an example of a trace that was recorded on a hospital physiology monitor, and the graph above shows the person breathing. So it's just when they inhale, the line goes up, when they exhale, it goes down. And they have a slightly irregular breath, but it's pretty much like a sinusoidal wave. It's going along evenly, and at the same time we recorded their electrocardiogram, so we have their heartbeat very precisely measured. When this person started singing, those traces looked really different. Okay? So this is a recording of the voice of a person singing, so we're representing a 30-second span of time on all of these graphs, and here is 30 seconds of the voice singing, so wherever the blue band gets really wide and thick, that's loud sounds, and when it gets very thin, that's silence. And so as the person is singing, these sort of long times where the blue is thick, that means there's a long time the singer has to sustain a phrase before they get to take another breath. And if you look at the breath form of that singer, you can see what that does to their breathing. So here, they're taking a really quick inhale, and then they're sustaining that exhale for a long time. The time that 2 or 3 breaths would have happened when they were just sitting there breathing beforehand. And then they have to do that again for the next phrase they have to sing, and it just keeps repeating. And so what's interesting about this to me is that the singer is spending almost all of their time exhaling, and that's the part of breathing that stimulates the vagal response. So it struck me that this could, like yoga breathing practices and meditation breathing practices, this could be another sort of very ancient practice that could serve in part a function of organizing breathing in a way that's going to elicit this healthy response. So not only do songs require this kind of breathing, but if you try and think about, if we're thinking about this as sort of a natural behavior of an organism, you'll ask, well, how did they perform this behavior sort of in the wild? What is the original form of this natural behavior? And about as far back as we can know that is the old traditional ballads and folk songs, which people sang, not performers on stages making a presentation to an audience, but everyday people sat around and sang to themselves for their own reasons. Because it was such a popular hobby, these so-called broadsheet ballads were printed on cheap paper and sold by the millions, some of which still survive today, like this one. And what I wanted to point out with showing you this is, one, there was a popular practice of people actually singing these songs, so it's a naturally occurring example of this vocal behavior. And two, look how many verses there are. This person is going to be singing for about 20 minutes. This is not a 3-minute radio track. So for the purpose of illustration, and because many of you know me as a singer rather than as a lecturer, I'm going to take this opportunity to sing you one song as an example of this form, and it's a long, long song, because that's the form that's required for these effects to come into play. I'm not going to sing one as long as I just showed you, but you could try and notice what the inhaling and exhaling pattern of the breath is, and you might also notice if anything about the breathing or about the voice is changing from the beginning to the end. And I'm not nearly a good enough singer to mock that effect for you, so if you hear something, it's probably coming from my vagus nerve. Come all you men and maidens, and listen to my rhyme concerning a fair maiden just hastening in her prime. Her cheeks were red as roses, her hair was deep dark brown. She was known as blooming Caroline of Edinburgh town. Young Henry, being a roving lad, a-courting to her came. And when her parents learned of this, they were angry at the same. Young Henry being offended, these words did to her say, "Arise, my dearest Caroline, and we will go away. And we will go to London, and there we'll wed with speed. And there, my dearest Caroline, we'll have happiness indeed." She came tripping down the stairs, her hair was hanging down, and away went blooming Caroline of Edinburgh town. O'er lofty hills and mountains this couple they did roam, until they came to London town, far, far from their home. She said, "Dearest Henry, and in the wood to eat such food as on the bushes grow. Some strangers they did pity her, and some did on her frown, and some did say, "What made you stray from Edinburgh town?" Under a lofty oak tree this maid began to cry, and watching all the gallant ships as they went sailing by, she gave 3 shrieks for Henry, and cast her body down, and away went blooming Caroline from Edinburgh town. A bonnet and a lock of hair she left upon the sand, and in a note these words she wrote, as you will understand. I'm fast asleep in the ocean deep, with fishes all around. I was once called Blooming Caroline of Edinburgh town. So in the Dr. Seuss book, I got this quote from. She says, thing, that thing can sing. That thing can sing like anything. Song, a long, long song. Goodbye, thing, you sing too long. but it illustrates very well this point that in order to sing a song like this with these long extended phrases, that go without any breaks. There's no little chorus or instrumental break to give the singer a chance to catch their breath. They have to sustain it verse after verse after verse for 5, 10, 15 minutes. It's almost like, a Jane Fonda workout for the vagus nerve. It's surprisingly a good stimulus. So that makes a prediction which we can test, and I'm going to show you my first bit of data right now. We don't have any funding or institutional approval to do experiments on human subjects yet. So everything I'm going to show you are tests that we've run on ourselves in the lab, just to see if we can get the equipment to work and if we've got a proof of concept that we could do an experiment. So I showed you these waveforms before, and that's just to remind you, regular breathing is kind of even up and down. Singing breathing is really different. It's got these kind of long ramps going on that we think should increase the vagal nerve. And the prediction is that every time you get this calming response or this vagal nerve activated, the heart rate should slow down, but it should only slow down during the breathing out. So to test that, I'm going to show you a graph. This is the heart rate in beats per minute. So if the number is here, it means a person's heart is beating 100 times a minute. And this is going to ask how fast is the heart beating at the end of the second heartbeat in that breath. So when you get to the second heartbeat, how fast is it going? When you get to the fourth heartbeat, how fast is it going? All the way out, I think, to the 7th heartbeat. And so we took all the breaths that were long enough that there were 7 heartbeats in them, and we analyzed that. So what we're predicting is if a vagal nerve is off, if we're in fight or flight response, if a person is just nervous and stressed, we should have a line that goes flat across. They've got a heart rate, whatever it is, but breathing out isn't giving it any calming response because the vagal nerve is not on. But if the vagal nerve has been activated, then we should see slanting lines that go down because every exhalation will be slowing the heart rate. It'll be getting slower and slower as they breathe out. So the black line here corresponds to this graph up here, what was happening before the person started singing. And although it's jumping around a little bit, you can see that it's pretty flat. There's no overall trend of it going up or down as a function of how long the person has been breathing out. But then in the red curve, we see the average over all the breaths that were taken in the first 20 minutes of singing ballads like the one I just sang for you. And you can see after 20 minutes, this curve is beginning to have a downward slope. Their breaths, their heartbeats that come toward the end of an exhalation are a little bit slower than the ones that came at the beginning. And what's better, if they keep on singing, in the next 20 minutes, between minute 20 and 40, it's going down even more. And between 40 and 60 minutes, it's going down even more. So there's two things. The curves start to slope, which gives us evidence that we have stimulated the vagal nerve by singing, which was our one hypothesis. And then you'll also note that the overall curves are beginning to go down. The red one is higher than the green one, is higher than the blue one. And that's because cumulatively, the calming effect and the slowing of the heart rate is bringing that person's heart rate down, down, down. What happens when they stop singing is really interesting. That's shown by this magenta curve here. So now they're not doing all this work. They don't have to provide this effortful activity of singing. Their heart rate goes way down. But even though they're not singing anymore, their vagal nerve is still active. So it's still slowing down their heart every exhale, which implies to us that since that vagal nerve is active, it's also sending those signals out to the rest of the body with those restorative and soothing commands. So that's a little tidbit of evidence that it may be true that having people stand and sing for as little as 20 minutes, but optimally much longer, could actually increase their vagal tone. And there have been studies showing that people who have high vagal tone are more resilient in their responses to crises. Even combat soldiers who have this kind of vagal tone before they're sent off on a mission are much less likely to develop PTSD than combat soldiers whose resting vagal rate looks flat like this. And there's other evidence that people who have mental health conditions in which their vagus is underactive, these other practices like yoga and meditation that give them therapeutic improvements also give them this signature in their heart rhythm. So that's that part. I want to get to the other topics that I promised you. So we talked about the danger and safety system in the brain and body, and why taking a deep breath isn't just a saying. When someone's upset or anxious, the deep breathing physically regulates the nerve that settles and calms the body and the mind. So now let's talk about wearing your heart on your voice. What do I mean by that? So I'm going to talk a little bit about a concept called prosody. And prosody is all the things we communicate when we speak that's not in the words. So it's the other stuff. And if I can get an audio sample to work, I have a brief example for you.
John! Marcia! John! John? Marcia? John? Marcia?
Okay, I think you get the idea. Some of you may recognize that as an old comedy skit from Stan Freberg. But it's a great illustration of the fact that they are saying the exact same two words in every couplet of the entire dialogue, and yet clearly a whole story is being told, and a lot of the extra content that's being communicated is emotional and relational information. And so prosody is the ability to add in the inflections and tones of our voice information that conveys this emotional and social content, and it's another completely natural biological phenomenon, but it's modulated by this fear and safety system. So when you're in fight or flight mode, when your adrenaline is high and you feel unsafe, the speech becomes more flat. So a person will speak in a more rapid staccato voice that'll tend to be more monotone, and people might describe their voice as having a harsh edge to it. So they might speak like, "Get yourself and all your things in here right now before I have to tell somebody." You know, very constant pitch, very rapid machine gun-like delivery. Whereas when a person is calm, when their vagal nerve is active, the speech is naturally more prosodic, which is described as being slower, more rhythmically fluid, having the pitch modulated up and down in different ways to express different emotions, but it's modulation of pitch rather than being flat. And the voice is somehow more resonant. These are features that are well recognized clinically, and speech therapists and psychotherapists work with them as clinical diagnostics to talk about these type of speech. Aprosodic speech is a symptom of deep depression. It's also a symptom of autism. It can also be caused by strokes to language areas in the brain, and this kind of speech is characteristic of someone who has that resilient vagal response that we were talking about before. So to tie that into the circuit we were talking about before, we have this sort of heart-breath loop that I introduced earlier. And as I mentioned, when this loop is active, it's also sending out signals to the somatic or body restorative functions, digestion, and immunity, and healing. But what I didn't tell you is that the same nerve, the same branch of the vagal nerve that slows the heart rate down, also is directly connected to all of the muscles of vocal production. It sends a branch up into the facial muscles that control the larynx, the pharynx, the soft palate, basically all the muscles that we use to create vocalizations. And so that gives it the capacity, anyway, by virtue of wiring. It could be that this is the direct mechanism whereby those muscles are retoned or stimulated to produce this more prosodic sounding speech. I drew an arrow backwards because it's possible there are sensory endings in these vocal muscles that send signals back to that calming center. So it's possible that the sensations that we have in our body of making those vocal expressions will inform the activity of this circuit feedback into this loop as well. And what's more, that same nerve that is involved in this circuit sends a branch to the auditory system. It sends a nerve to control how tight your eardrum is, which allows it to be tuned towards optimized for human voice when you are feeling safe, and relatively blocking out human voice frequency ranges when you are feeling under danger. So again, when the calming center or the vagal nerve is active, it's sending out signals that actually make it easier for you to hear and receive a human voice. And there's anecdotal reasons to believe that the ability to hear emotional tones in other people's voices can actually input and help control this system. So you know this if you're a nurse or a first responder and you've been taught how to go into a room with a bunch of panicky people. The first thing you have to do is speak to them in a soft, soothing, slow, calm voice, because this will get them to settle down and not be so scared. And so experiences like that lead to the idea that we have circuits that receive those signals of that a calm person puts in their voice that might actually directly connect to this system and help us calm our own systems. And so this idea that these things are all linked together was really first put together by a scholar named Stephen Porges. And he called this whole circuit the social engagement system. And I've just labeled prosody here. So if your vagal nerve is active and everything is in a calm state, then these muscles put out sounds that have prosody. And if prosody is coming into your ears, it may increase this calm state. So we have this kind of prosody in, prosody out social model of how the voice can soothe ourselves and others. And Stephen Porges really pioneered work on this, and he calls this the social communication system. And so I draw this little heart-shaped thing as a mnemonic to help people remember that, and for this sort of perhaps corny idea of saying that when you are calm, your heart knows it because your heart rhythms change, and you're wearing that rhythm basically on your voice because your same nerve that's giving you that heart rhythm is giving you these voice qualities. Okay, so what does that have to do with singing? I'm going to turn now, as I said briefly, to the question of tunes and words and stories of songs. And we're going to go back to the songs that you find in the wild behavior of this animal, which is the traditional folk songs that have been collected, that, as far as we know, existed in oral tradition for hundreds of years, being sung by regular people who might not have been good singers, but who sang these songs for their own, some benefit of their own. Some of them are excellent singers, but I don't think the singing was limited to those. So actually, I think it was Tom Lehrer who had a skit. He made a spoof of a traditional folk song, and when he introduced it, he said, well, I'm going to sing you a traditional folk song, and the way you'll know it's a folk song is because it's modal. And that means every now and then I'll throw in a wrong note. and he could have gone on to say, it's also rubato, and that means I can't count. So, but what many people have observed is if you record folk singers in situ, who were not trained in any academic way, most of the traditional songs, or a surprising majority of them, have what we would call gapped scales, which means that they only use a few notes of the scale that we would now typically use in contemporary Western music. And to give you an example of gap scales, a lot of the songs that are collected in Appalachia, for example, are pentatonic. That means they only use 5 notes of the scale, and none of those notes are next to each other. So you could play the whole song on just the black keys of a keyboard. And so a couple of examples of those. Here's the Cherry Tree Carol. When Joseph were an old man were he courted Virgin Mary, the Queen of Galilee. He courted Virgin Mary, the Queen of Galilee. If I hadn't started so low, that would have just been 5 notes. But they don't all sound the same. So another one is, Lord Bateman was a noble lord in high degree. He could not rest or be contented till he had sailed the old salt sea. Another one from North Carolina, just to give you 3 examples. Witza had me a wife, she gave me trouble all my life. She made me work in the cold rain and snow. Rain and snow, rain and snow. She made me work in the cold rain and snow. big spaces between the notes. And so when you sing them, you're forced to modulate your pitch. The singer is, so here's where the speculations are starting to come in. They're being forced to emulate prosodic speech. Whatever mood you're in, if you're angry or not, you have to make your voice go up and down in big gaps to sing the song. And you might have also noticed that those traditional songs have a very fluid timing. Notes are just kind of drawn out as long as the singer feels like, and so you break up that staccato, fire gun-like, machine gun-like rhythm that the anxious speech has, and generally they have slower tempos than a lot of other music. So that's the tune aspects, and to sum up, my claim is that those qualities of the tune mimic or actually exaggerate what makes prosodic speech prosodic. And then with regard to the words, the lyrics are very repetitive. You could say boring. Often they'll have whole verses stolen from other well-known ballads, or the same stock phrase is repeated 6 or 7 times over the course of a ballad. And the thinking on this is that this evolves in order to help people memorize the songs, but also I think it speaks to an important brain difference in how these songs are represented. Speech is a left brain activity, and when we speak, we have words, they have semantic meaning, and we use grammatic rules to organize them in a way that's going to communicate a message that we want to say. And that's very different from singing. In singing, you have a memorized sequence that just kind of flows out inexorably as a gestalt whole. It's very difficult to start in the middle. There's no choosing and parsing grammar in the middle. It's a muscle memory. It's sort of a continuous arc. And so it's been known for a long time, actually, that the neural circuits that are required for singing and speaking are different. And in particular, many people who have speech deficits, including stuttering and aphasias, who are unable to produce speech fluently or at all, turn out to be able to sing very well. And there were also studies of inactivating right and left hemispheres of healthy patients and showing that the different hemispheres are in charge of these different activities. So that's just to say that singing a lyric is not the same as talking. And the last thing people have noticed about about the traditional folk songs is a lot of them have what they call agonistic tone, which is they're violent, there's lots of murders and battles and people dying and jumping off cliffs, and they're often very sad. And what?
Being unfaithful.
Yes, being unfaithful, there's an awful lot of that. Unlike the real world. So to speculate about that, if it's true that this singing is a special activity that keeps your brain in this right brain gestalt mode and exercises this pathway for your emotional resilience and for recovering your feeling of safety and overcoming your feeling of danger, then maybe it's like kind of a calisthenic workout, throw a very frightening or anger-inducing stimulus at you that would rev up your fight or flight response, and then in that context, you bring it right back down again because the singing itself is soothing and takes that away. So it could be like a little exercise to that part of your brain to make it stronger and more flexible for dealing with the stresses we have in life. So now I'm really absolutely speculating. So to sum up before I get to proposed experiment in my last minute, I'm talking about singing as a natural vocal behavior of our species, that we evolved for some survival function. I talked about how we process danger and safety, that it's processed throughout the brain and the body, and that processing can go awry and leave us in a bad place, so we need ways to recover from that place. And I talked about components of singing and how I speculate with more evidence in some cases that singing might have that sort of healing function. So the most supported, which I think is very well, a lot of evidence, is that the kind of pattern of deep breathing that's required to generate singing directly stimulates the vagus nerve and turns on this calming response. And it's no wonder, therefore, that people report when they sing in community choirs or they get together and sing at peace rallies or churches that they feel elation and joy, or their stresses melt away, and there's a nerve for that. The fact that breathing out makes your heart slow down and breathing in speeds it up, in other words, your breathing controls your heart rhythm, explains why the mysterious and amazing result that if you monitor the hearts of all the members of a choir while they are singing, their hearts synchronize. And that was published several years ago from a group in Germany, but it makes perfect sense because they have to breathe at the same time because they have to sing what they're supposed to sing. Then we talked about how, on top of breathing, just making a vocal sound broadcasts to the world whether your vagus is on or off, because there's tones in the voice that reveal it. And these voice qualities can also control that response. They can make hearing an angry voice can make you angry, and hearing a soothing voice can soothe you. So it's a two-way street. Tunes have lots of pitch change and dynamic timing, which looks to me like super exaggerated prosody, in other words, trying to mimic or force the singer to adopt the kind of vocal production that they would have if they were feeling okay. I just talked a little bit about how the left brain, right brain distinction between talking and singing. I don't know how that really ties into this circuit that I talked about before, but I just thought I should mention it. And then speculation that these dark narratives might serve what Aristotle would have called a cathartic function, but we can maybe give it a little bit more of a neural description. Okay, so I promised you testable predictions, so I'm just going to get there in the very end here. Here's the hypothesis. So the vocal vagal hypothesis of how singing soothes the soul. 3 parts. 1, singing increases vagal tone, that calming response. And I showed you one experiment that was done on one subject who sang for a whole hour, that was me, and showed that it looks like it might be true, but of course we need to replicate that in a lot of other subjects. The second part is that something about the song structure and also the vagal tone that you get from that singing would imbue the voice with some cue called prosody. And the third part is that prosody can be detected by listeners, and when they hear prosody, it increases their vagal tone and brings them into a calmer state. So we're doing an experiment right now. I'm going back to our very long song. It's very simple. We take a singer who's going to sing a very long song, and we strap them up to a physiology monitor so that we can measure their breathing, we can measure their heart. So we'll be able to tell if their vagus nerve is stimulated because the heart will slow down on these exhales. We'll also measure their voice at the same time. Step 2 is we take that voice and we put it through fancy analysis algorithms. I will have no time to explain that, but we think that in this fancy analysis algorithm, if the sound looks like this kind of Christmas tree, that would be a sound with prosody. And we're going to check if we're right about that, because we'll take a lot of sounds and find out if all the ones that look like this correspond to the ones that have the predicted heart rhythm of the singer. And once we've got that, finally, we can play these sounds to the listener and record their heart and their breathing and find out whether their vagal nerve is getting stimulated or not by the listening. And if we can show an arc for how the vagal nerve is stimulated, it produces a signal that goes out into the world and is received by another person, and of course also the singer hears their own voice, then we'll have really the bare bones of starting to dissect the neural mechanisms of this really interesting aspect of how singing functions socially. So I'm going to stop there so I have time for a question or two. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was interesting. And nice to listen to as well. Other questions or comments? Oh, I see some hands. I'll make my way around the room.
Have you considered at all the difference between various types of singing? The examples you're using are mostly folk songs, which have a fairly common, fairly standard rhythm, and at least the examples you used are fairly, not soporific, but they are relaxing, they're calm. But I was thinking when you were talking about this, what happens with the person who winds up going into the choral finale of Beethoven's Ninth? Is there either, just to use an extreme example, are there any connections or comparisons that you can theorize on at this point?
Yeah, so of course theory is the big word. The mechanical stimulation of the vagal nerve by the breathing, I think, is going to be involved in any kind of singing that requires diaphragmatic breathing. And if it's something really powerful like, O Fortuna or the Beethoven's Ninth, that would seem likely to occur. But then the structure of the song that you're singing is also going to play a role. How fast it is and how modulated it is certainly will change what the vocal output contains and what the listener will receive. So I think it's going to get complicated. We need to be able to record the voice all by itself. So if there's any instruments, if there's any harmony, we wouldn't be able to do the analysis. So it was helpful experimentally to have a form that involved a cappella voice. But yes, I'm sure the generalization will not be trivial.
Thank you.
Hi. I found this fascinating. You're the first person I've encountered in 20 years who had a discussion about vagal tone. The reason I bring that up is 20 years ago I started my first doctoral dissertation and the topic was vagal tone. So my first techie question is, when you're talking about heart rate as your measure of vagal tone, are you talking about absolute heart rate, or are you talking about beat-to-beat variability?
Right. So in the interest of time, I did gloss over a lot of the details about how we look at the effect of vagus on the heart. So it's not just the heartbeat, which can be modulated by a lot of things. Even just pumping up your adrenaline will change your heartbeat. We're looking at specifically the respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and not even just heart rate variability. So you can see if your heart is speeding up when you breathe in and slowing down when you breathe out, that if you just measured the time between your heartbeats and counted them all up, they would be variable. They would not all be the same. And so that's a common way to measure whether we think the vagus is active. But we're actually working on algorithms to specifically look at breath cycle and trained decelerations. So that's for the expert.
Okay, thank you. The second real quick comment is, when you're talking about feedback from the vocal to providing some soothing, the third pathway that didn't get mentioned was somatic perception of the vibrations that you get that aren't auditory, but you perceive them when you're singing, and that is another.
Absolutely true.
I've wondered that is another feedback mechanism.
Absolutely true. There's visceral sensation that feels the vibrations in the viscera. There's feedback from the vocal muscles, proprioceptive feedback from the vocal muscles, and there's the auditory feedback. All three, yes.
Okay. Well, I could talk for hours, but I'll pass the mic on.
My comment is directed over here to the other question from a singer. So I would just like to ask him if, when he sings an exciting chorus like does he feel good? Does it make you feel good to sing in a choir?
Short answer, yes.
I have a disclaimer here. I'm a speech therapist, so couple of things. Excellent information, and it's certainly things that I have never thought about that you're looking into, and so go for it. The question that I have is, we in talking and in singing, we inhale so much more quickly than we exhale. And I would think, too, in singing, that it's primarily the vowels that are doing the heavy lifting in terms of voice production. Is that anything you're dealing with? Have you thought about that? Or does it make make any difference to you in what you're trying to figure out?
Yes, I think the vowels are where because when in between the vowels, you actually stop the flow of air, right? So it's when you have those long vowels that you actually are having that sustained muscle, diaphragmatic muscle exhalation. And in songs, of course, those vowels get stretched out a lot more compared to speech. And some of this I couldn't get into, much too long to get into what this analysis is we're doing here, but it's both looking at where there's harmonic structure in the spectrogram, which is what you see when there's a vowel, a sustained vowel, and then also looking at how much the structure is modulating from second to second. So it's going to be picking up on those features, I think.
Simple, short question. What is the Dr. Seuss book that the illustration versus from?
Oh gosh, I should have that reference, but I think it's Hop on Pop.
I'm thinking lullaby,
Absolutely, yeah.
and the lullaby, you are trying to get kid in your lap as calmed down, as bored, as quiet as possible. And the proper lullaby has all of the things that you describe. And you can continue it indefinitely. Kid doesn't care whether it makes sense, as long as they go to sleep.
Right, it's what some people call the lilting quality of the tune of the voice. And what's really interesting, if you look at folk lullabies and you read the lyrics, they're ghastly. They're just, then the wolves will come and eat you, and you can't believe there's, in fact, people have written books about what the lullabies are the most violent, dark lyrics. Yeah, you're going to fall out of a tree. And I wonder if that goes along with this sort of catharsis hypothesis where the mother's sitting there with the wolves at the door. She's terrified, but she's got to somehow get that out of her body and out of her voice so that she can project the sort of animal signals that the child needs to feel that they are safe, and so they're talking about these verbalizing these conscious fears while using the voice that would go with the quiet piece.
Singing while working, especially doing work where your own body is the power source for the work and not some machine. People have always, I guess partly when they're working together to keep in rhythm, but it must also just help them feel okay dealing with the hard work.
That would stand to reason, with the caveat that you just said that some of it is really for coordinating the timing of teamwork, but
But they sing when they're alone.
Yes, likely explains why some of the most oppressed workers in history have sung while they work.
Thank you so much for driving all of